I never thought the sound of my own footsteps could feel like a sentence being passed. Every echo against the tile floor that morning reminded me that nothing would ever be the same. When I entered the bathroom, the light overhead was unforgiving, illuminating every inch of the reflection I wasn't ready to face. The boy I had known all my life, carefree, untamed, unconcerned with appearance, was dissolving before my eyes, replaced by something delicate, fragile, and utterly alien. My hair had been brushed and straightened to perfection, falling past my shoulders with a softness that was almost cruel in its contrast to the rough hands I used to call my own. My skin seemed smaller, tighter, the faint curve of my cheeks hinting at a femininity I had never possessed, and my eyes, lined faintly with pencil that my mother had insisted I wear, stared back at me with a vulnerability I couldn't place. My heart raced, a drumbeat of fear and fascination. Behind me, my mother's presence was a quiet weight pressing into my spine, her hands clasped calmly, eyes sharp and observant. "Do you like what you see?" she asked, voice steady, almost clinical, yet laden with expectation. I wanted to scream, to deny, to tell her that this was wrong, that I wasn't ready. Instead, my lips moved in a small, hesitant nod. That gesture, so insignificant in the grand scheme, felt like a betrayal of everything I had believed about myself. My mother's faint smile was a confirmation, a signal that the first lesson had begun, and the web of obedience she was weaving around me was already tightening. That was the day I realized that my reflection would no longer belong solely to me. Every day following, I was reminded that my body, my gestures, even my thoughts could be molded, sculpted, trained to fit the vision my parents had of me. I learned the subtle mechanics of movement, how to place my hands just so, how to tilt my chin, how to shift weight in a way that felt unnatural but somehow made me feel like I was performing a silent ritual of submission. My father's presence was even more intimidating than my mother. He didn't need to raise his voice to command obedience. His gaze, sharp and unrelenting, cut into my posture, into my thoughts, into the smallest details of my comportment. Every misstep, every hesitation, felt like a failure I could not afford. My clothing, once an afterthought, became a canvas of transformation. Pastels, ruffles, delicate fabrics I had once mocked now became instruments of my daily lessons. The first dress they had me wear, a pale, whisper-soft pink with gentle ruffles along the sleeves, was almost too beautiful to touch. When I stepped into it, fumbling and trembling, the boy I had been seemed to shrink inside me, leaving a hollow space filled with uncertainty, fear, and an unfamiliar, creeping curiosity. I looked at my reflection, and for the first time I didn't recognize the person who stared back. Her eyes, though mine, carried an expression I had never worn, tentative, uncertain, yet undeniably present. And beneath the fear, a subtle, uneasy warmth began to rise, a flicker of intrigue I wasn't supposed to feel. The days blurred together after that. Every morning brought new instructions, the exact way to apply a brush of color to my lips, the precise angle to hold my head while walking, the measured inflection in my voice that made each word softer, lighter, almost musical. At first, it was mechanical, a performance I could endure only because refusal was not permitted. But the repetition began to erode my resistance. I caught myself practicing the sway of my hips in secret, adjusting my posture when no one was looking, testing the resonance of my new voice in empty rooms. The lessons were relentless, and yet I found myself involuntarily absorbing them, internalizing the behaviors that had once been forced. It wasn't just the external transformation that consumed me. Inside, a storm was growing. I questioned every instinct, every thought, every feeling. Was this humiliation, or was it revelation? Was the girl in the mirror merely a construct of my parents' will, or a version of myself that had been dormant all along, waiting for the world to shape her? These questions gnawed at me in silence, echoing louder than any reprimand or instruction. I began to notice the subtle joys hidden within the confinement, the soft brush of fabric against my skin, the gentle weight of long hair over my shoulders, the quiet satisfaction in meeting my mother's gaze with precision and poise. Each moment was a paradox, both imprisonment and awakening. The emotional complexity reached a fever pitch one evening when my parents left me alone in the room. I lingered in front of the mirror longer than ever before, tracing the contours of my face, my hands, the the faint blush along my cheeks that had been coaxed into existence with careful guidance. I ran my fingers through my hair, feeling its unnatural silkiness, and wondered if this identity would ever be mine, or if it would remain an imposed mask, a performance for the approval of those I could never fully please. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered to the girl in the mirror, asking questions I had no answers for, wrestling with emotions I had never anticipated. Fear, longing, shame, curiosity, and an emerging, dangerous sense of possibility. By the time the day ended, I realized that the lessons were only beginning. I did not know if I would ever fully accept this transformation, or if I would secretly yearn to return to my old self. What I did know was that the rules were set, the instructions immutable, and the girl in the mirror was now an inseparable part of my existence. Each heartbeat reminded me that nothing could undo the changes that had begun, both visible and invisible. And in the quiet aftermath, I understood the first, terrifying truth. Becoming her was no longer optional, it was inevitable. The first week blurred into a haze of mirrors, soft fabrics, and constant instruction. Every waking moment was measured, observed, and corrected, and yet somehow I began to feel a strange intimacy with the process. I could not name it at the time. Was it compliance, submission, or a faint spark of recognition that this body, this new form, might be part of me in ways I had never dared to imagine? The mornings were the worst. The sun had barely risen, and my mother would already be standing in the doorway, a serene, watchful presence inspecting every detail. "Lift your chin slightly," she would say. "The shoulders, yes, straighter, try again." Her voice was calm, but behind it lay a relentless force that I could neither resist nor deflect. Each correction, each subtle critique, etched itself into my muscles, my posture, my very consciousness. I became a student of myself, endlessly dissecting and reshaping who I was supposed to be. And then there were the clothing lessons. Fabrics I had once scorned became instruments of control and revelation. Silks and satins glided over my skin with a cool intimacy that felt alien. Lace brushed against my fingertips, teasing my nerves with softness I had never allowed myself to notice. My mother insisted that every outfit reflect precision, modesty, and grace, and I began to understand that the smallest fold, the slightest crease, could convey either discipline or failure. One afternoon, she handed me a pale lavender dress, flowing and delicate, and I hesitated. My hands shook as I lifted it from the hanger, feeling the weight of expectation in every thread. The moment I stepped into it, my reflection in the mirror caught me by surprise. I looked different, not just in appearance but in presence. There was a subtle elegance in the way the fabric fell, in the sway of my shoulders, in the tilt of my head. And yet, beneath the fleeting thrill, an undercurrent of panic pulsed through me. I was being remade, reshaped, and I had no say in the matter. My voice underwent a transformation just as profound as my outward appearance. My father had begun to insist that I speak in a softer, higher register, one that would command attention without aggression, that would convey politeness, charm, and, most terrifyingly, obedience. At first, it felt unnatural, forced. I stumbled over words, misjudged tones, and faltered in conversation. Each failure was met with disapproval, subtle but sharp, until I became hyper-aware of every syllable that passed my lips. Slowly, however, the rhythm began to settle into my chest and throat. There were moments when I caught myself speaking in that voice alone, without prompting, a faint warmth rising in my chest as I realized I could make the sound linger, gentle and deliberate. It was intoxicating in a way I could not fully understand. Evenings were the most dangerous time. When my parents left the room, I was left alone with the reflection I was beginning to inhabit more and more, questioning, exploring, and sometimes resenting her. I would run my fingers over the soft folds of dresses I had learned to love only under duress, tracing the lines of collars, ruffles, and hems. My hair, brushed and braided with care, slid through my fingers like liquid, and I would catch myself imagining how it felt, how it moved, how it defined me. The emotions were contradictory: fear, shame, fascination, and the faintest glimmer of desire, not in the way one longs for someone else, but in the way one recognizes an emerging self previously unknown. I began to realize that the girl in the mirror was not entirely a stranger. She was forming in real time, carving out a space inside me I could not yet name or fully claim. Social interactions became a new battlefield. My parents insisted that I practice conversations, polite smiles, measured gestures, and attentive listening even when no one else was around. I found myself rehearsing phrases before going to school, imagining the stares of classmates and the faint surprise or curiosity that might flicker in their eyes. How would they see me? Would they recognize me as the same person, or only as the girl my family had been teaching me to become? Every thought, every imagined glance, every tiny adjustment in posture felt like a test I could not fail. The anxiety was suffocating, yet the sense of discovery beneath it was undeniable. I was learning to inhabit a form I had never been invited to inhabit before, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to understand that this forced obedience was reshaping not only my body, but the contours of my mind. One afternoon, my father called me into the living room. I had been practicing the walk he insisted I perfect, the sway of my hips measured and precise, and my hands hovering lightly at my sides. He observed silently, then nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before handing me a compact mirror and a small set of brushes. "We will refine your expression," he said, voice low, deliberate. The words carried no anger, no pressure, yet the weight of them pressed down harder than any shout ever could. I took the tools in trembling hands, aware that even the smallest mistake could unravel the progress I had painfully constructed. And yet, as I applied color to my lips, traced gentle lines along my eyelids, I felt a strange satisfaction, a thrill in mastering the delicate art of transformation. I was learning the rules, obeying the instructions, and yet within the act itself, I discovered a sense of control I hadn't expected. Night fell, and I remained in the mirror long after my parents had left, tracing every contour of my face, adjusting my posture, practicing my voice in whispers that barely disturbed the air. I felt the tension coiling within me, a tightrope between fear and fascination, between resistance and reluctant curiosity. I was discovering a strange intimacy with my new self, a sense that this girl, fragile, precise, obedient, was beginning to exist in a parallel space alongside the boy I had once been. And though I fought it, tried to cling to the old identity, I sensed that the transformation was far from superficial. It had begun to etch itself into my very consciousness, rewriting the ways I thought, moved, and even breathed. By the time the week ended, I realized that the lessons were no longer just about appearances or behavior. They were about endurance, about inhabiting an identity that felt both imposed and inevitable. Each moment of instruction, each correction, each glance in the mirror was a thread weaving me into a fabric I had never chosen but could not escape. And in the quiet of my room, staring at the girl in the mirror, I understood the first terrifying truth. She was here to stay, whether I accepted her or not, and the journey to becoming her, truly, irrevocably, was only beginning. I woke that morning to the sound of my mother's voice outside my door, soft but unmistakably authoritative. "Rise, my dear. Today we will begin with posture," she called, and I felt my chest tighten before I even opened my eyes. There was no warmth in the words, only expectation, a subtle insistence that I move, respond, and comply. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, feeling the sheets cling to my skin like a reminder of the comfort I was no longer allowed. My reflection in the dresser mirror caught my gaze for a moment, and I froze. Her face, no, my face, looked different under the gentle morning light, softer somehow, almost fragile. My lips were full, the line of my jaw smaller than it had been yesterday, and my hair fell in a loose cascade that framed my cheeks in a way I was still trying to reconcile. I felt a flicker of panic rise in my chest. Had I changed overnight, or had I only noticed the transformation now? Breakfast was quiet. My father sat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes sweeping across me as if measuring every nuance. He didn't speak at first, but his silence was heavier than any command. Every bite, every movement was scrutinized. I kept my posture upright, my hands delicate on the table, my voice measured when responding to my mother's casual questions about the day ahead. It was exhausting, performing obedience so completely that it almost began to feel natural, though the tightness in my chest told me otherwise. My parents' satisfaction was subtle, a barely perceptible nod, a brief glance of approval, yet I felt the weight of every moment pressing down. By the time I left the table, my back ached from holding myself in the precise alignment they demanded, and my mind was already spinning through the lessons ahead. The morning was consumed by instruction in walking. My mother insisted that I move as though every step carried significance, that my hips sway lightly, deliberately, that my feet land with grace and intent. I practiced in the hallway, packing over the tiles in measured strides, my arms hovering slightly, fingers lightly curled, as though even my hands could betray hesitation. She watched me, correcting the tilt of my head, the tension in my shoulders, the faint bend in my knees. More elegance, my dear. Imagine the eyes of the world on you, she instructed, and I shivered. The lesson was not just about physical movement. It was about inhabiting a presence I had never claimed, being a form I had never accepted, and yet was being demanded to embody. Each correction, each subtle adjustment, carved itself into my awareness, leaving me exhausted but increasingly aware of the delicate mechanics of my new identity. After hours of walking practice, I was given the task of selecting an outfit for the afternoon. The wardrobe was a carefully curated collection of soft fabrics, pastels, and delicate details that I had learned to recognize not as clothing, but as instruments of instruction. I hesitated, running my fingers over a pale blue dress with tiny lace trimmings, feeling the fabric's weight, the softness against my fingertips. "Yes, that one," my mother said, noticing my hesitation. "It will teach you restraint and composure. Do not disappoint me." I stepped into the dress, fumbling slightly, and when I looked into the mirror, I startled at my own reflection. The girl who stared back at me seemed even more distinct, more complete. Her cheeks were lightly flushed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, her posture beginning to reflect the hours of painstaking guidance. I traced the lines of the dress, the gentle ruffles along the sleeves, and felt a strange, unnameable sensation in my chest. Fascination intertwined with panic, an awareness that I was both myself and someone entirely new. The afternoon was devoted to voice. My father insisted that I speak in a softer, measured tone, practicing phrases and sentences until the inflection, pitch, and cadence were precise. At first, I stumbled over every word, my voice cracking, my throat tightening as if rebelling against the unfamiliar sound. His gaze was unwavering, his instructions patient yet insistent. "Again," slowly. "With control," he said, and I repeated the phrases, my mind hyper-aware of every vibration in my throat, every subtle rise and fall. Hours passed, and gradually my voice began to settle, higher, lighter, more melodic, yet every utterance carried the weight of self-consciousness. I found myself whispering in the quiet moments, testing the resonance, allowing myself a private intimacy with the sound. It was a strange thrill, realizing that even in obedience, I could discover a facet of myself that had been hidden, waiting to emerge under the meticulous guidance of my parents. As evening approached, I was instructed to practice gestures and expressions. Every smile, every tilt of the head, every blink was choreographed. I caught myself in the mirror repeatedly, adjusting, readjusting, noting subtle differences in muscle tension, eye contact, and posture. My fingers brushed against my cheeks, tracing the faint flush my mother had encouraged, and I marveled at the precision required to maintain the appearance of natural softness. I wondered, not for the first time, if this girl, the one I was being taught to be, was entirely separate from me, or if she was slowly merging with my consciousness, reshaping my thoughts, my emotions, my very sense of self. The idea terrified me. Yet beneath the fear, a faint flicker of exhilaration glimmered. The realization that I could exist in this new form, explore it, even if it was under duress. Night fell, and I remained alone with my reflection longer than ever before. I adjusted the folds of my dress, ran my fingers through my hair, and whispered questions to the girl who stared back. "Who are you? Who am I? Will I ever belong to myself again?" The answers did not come, only the echo of my own voice in the empty room, mingled with the faint, persistent rhythm of my heartbeat. I traced the lines of my collarbones, the curve of my shoulders, and marveled at how much could change in such a short time. How much I had changed without consent, without intention, and yet perhaps with a growing curiosity that frightened me more than obedience ever could. By the end of the night, exhaustion settled into my muscles, my mind, my very bones. Yet amidst the fatigue was a recognition that the lessons were no longer merely superficial. They were reshaping not just my appearance, but the architecture of my identity, carving paths in my consciousness that I had never traveled before. The girl in the mirror was no longer simply a reflection. She was becoming a presence, a companion, a mirror of possibilities I had not dared to acknowledge. And though I feared the inevitability of her existence, I could not deny the pull, the fascination, the quiet, terrifying wonder of discovering someone entirely new within myself. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, painting the room in soft, golden streaks, but it did nothing to warm the cold tension that gripped me. Today was different. I could feel it before I even opened my eyes. My mother's footsteps in the hallway were lighter than usual, almost gliding, and my father's faint murmur of approval from the living room seemed charged with something I couldn't yet name. They had announced yesterday that I would accompany my mother on errands, practicing composure, politeness, and restraint in the presence of strangers. The thought alone sent a shiver through me. Up until now, my lessons had been contained within the walls of our home, in rooms where I had no choice but to obey. Now, the world beyond my parents' watchful eyes awaited, and I realized with sudden panic that the girl I had been forced to become would have to face it, fully visible, fully judged. I dressed carefully, choosing a pale peach dress my mother had recommended, its soft fabric brushing my skin like a whispered command. The dress fell just below my knees, modest yet delicate, its ruffles and lace a reminder of the precision demanded in every lesson. My hair was brushed into loose waves, the ends curling gently against my shoulders. I applied the smallest hint of blush, enough to suggest femininity without drawing excessive attention, and practiced the tilt of my chin, the sway of my hips, the light lift of my hands as they hovered at my sides. My reflection in the mirror startled me again. The girl who stared back seemed fully aware of the impending exposure, her eyes wide with anxiety yet tinged with something almost like anticipation. I wanted to run, to retreat, but the quiet insistence of my parents' training held me in place. I was tethered to this new self, and the leash was taut. The walk to the market was a trial in subtlety. My mother held my hand, guiding me through the streets, correcting my posture at every step. "Softer, lighter, let your gaze wander gently," she murmured when she noticed the tension in my shoulders. I obeyed, swallowing the lump in my throat as strangers passed by. Each glance, each whisper of curiosity made my pulse spike. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but at the same time, there was a strange thrill in being seen, in existing in a form that demanded attention without aggression. My mother's hand was firm yet gentle, a reminder of the boundary between guidance and restraint. I realized that each correction, each subtle adjustment, was no longer merely about appearance. It was about inhabiting a presence, learning the mechanics of attention, the choreography of social existence. Inside the market, the lessons intensified. I was instructed on eye contact, gestures, speech, and reactions. When someone addresses you, respond softly with a measured smile. Do not fidget. Speak slowly as though your words carry weight, my mother coached, and I felt the weight of every instruction pressing into my chest. I practiced the movements, the soft lift of my shoulders, the tilt of my head, the gentle cadence of my voice, and I noticed the subtle effect on those around me. People smiled in return, some offered polite greetings, and I realized with a mixture of shock and fascination that the girl I was being trained to be had a presence, an influence, even in this small, mundane world. And yet, the exhilaration was mingled with fear of exposure, of judgment, of making a misstep that would betray the lessons so carefully instilled. By the time we returned home, I was exhausted. My muscles ached from holding myself with precision, my voice was strained from careful modulation, and my mind was spinning with awareness of every social nuance I had been forced to navigate. Yet, beneath the fatigue, a subtle awareness had begun to emerge. The realization that I could exist in this form beyond the walls of our home, that the girl I had been sculpted into could interact with the world in ways I had never imagined. The thought was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. I wanted to deny it, to cling to the old self that existed in shadows, but I could feel the threads of this new identity weaving into my consciousness, binding me to her in ways that were both thrilling and disorienting. The following days were a continuous cycle of instruction, correction, and reflection. My father focused on discipline, teaching me to maintain composure even when uncomfortable, to master subtle expressions that conveyed grace and obedience without revealing inner turmoil. My mother emphasized refinement, elegance, and presence, guiding me in gestures, speech, and the careful modulation of attention. Each moment became a lesson in endurance, awareness, and self-reconstruction. I began to notice the changes not only in my body, but in my thoughts, my reactions, my emotional responses. Fear, fascination, shame, and an unspoken exhilaration coexisted in a constant, shifting balance. I was learning to observe myself with unprecedented scrutiny, to inhabit a self that was at once imposed and emerging from within. One evening, I lingered in front of the mirror for hours, replaying the day's interactions. I traced the lines of my dress, adjusted the fall of my hair, and whispered questions into the silence. Who am I becoming? Is this really me or only a reflection of what they want? The girl who stared back seemed to answer with subtle movements. The tilt of her head, the lift of her eyebrows, the soft curve of her lips, signals that she was aware, conscious, and growing alongside me. I realized then that the lessons were not merely about obedience. They were about coexistence, about learning to live with a self that had been hidden, reshaped, and revealed simultaneously. I felt a flicker of connection, a fragile intimacy, with this new identity, even as fear and doubt surged beneath the surface. Night after night, the process continued, relentless and immersive. I would replay every gesture, every word, every movement, analyzing, correcting, refining. My reflection became a constant companion, a teacher, and a mirror of possibility. I began to notice subtle joys in the discipline, the feel of soft fabrics, the gentle sway of hair, the melody of a carefully modulated voice. Yet even as these small pleasures emerged, so too did the terror of permanence. The knowledge that the girl I was becoming was no longer temporary, no longer a performance, but an integral part of who I was and would be. By the end of the week, exhaustion and awareness had reached a fever pitch. I realized that the lessons were far beyond simple appearance or behavior. They were a restructuring of identity itself, a merging of imposed instruction and latent curiosity. The girl in the mirror was no longer simply a reflection. She had begun to occupy mental, emotional, and physical space alongside the boy I had been. And though fear and uncertainty pulsed through every heartbeat, I could not deny the subtle thrill, the quiet fascination, the deep, unsettling realization that I was irrevocably on a path of transformation, one step at a time, into someone entirely new. The morning light seeped through the curtains like liquid gold, but it did little to soothe the tight coil of anxiety in my chest. Today, my mother said, would be a lesson in patience, composure, and endurance, a full day of training to test how far I had internalized the lessons of the past weeks. I sat on the edge of my bed for several minutes before moving, my reflection staring back at me with a faintly accusatory gaze. The girl in the mirror was patient, poised, and alert, her eyes quietly questioning me. Would I rise to meet the day or falter under its demands? I ran my fingers through my hair, feeling the soft waves my mother had taught me to create, the ends falling perfectly along my shoulders. My dress, a gentle shade of lilac, was smooth under my fingertips, and I traced the hem and ruffles with care, knowing that every detail mattered, not only for appearance but for the discipline of attention that had become as essential as breathing. At breakfast, the usual ritual began with quiet observation. My father's gaze swept over me, weighing, measuring, noting subtle imperfections, while my mother's eyes were sharp and calm, tracking every movement, every inflection, every gesture. Hold the spoon lightly, she instructed softly. Lift your chin slightly and ensure your shoulders remain relaxed. I obeyed, each adjustment a deliberate act of mindfulness, a careful balancing of fear and fascination. Each swallow, each sip, each gesture became a lesson in precision, control, and presentation. By the time I had finished, my arms ached from maintaining posture, my neck stiff from attention, and my mind was already rehearsing the lessons that awaited me beyond the kitchen. The morning was devoted to walking and posture. My mother insisted that every step I took be measured, deliberate, and graceful. Imagine the floor beneath you is glass, she said. Do not disturb it. Your weight, your balance, every motion should be purposeful. I practiced in the hallway, repeating the motion until my muscles ached and my mind spun with awareness of each nuance. My hips swayed lightly, my shoulders remained aligned, my hands hovered delicately at my sides. The exercise was exhausting, but gradually a subtle awareness began to emerge. I could feel the rhythm of movement, the precision of balance, the way the air shifted around me with each step. I was learning not only to walk as they demanded, but to inhabit a presence, to exist fully in a form that was at once alien and increasingly familiar. By midday, my father introduced the vocal exercises. He instructed me to speak softly, with inflections designed to convey grace, attentiveness, and politeness, while maintaining control over every syllable. At first, my words stumbled, my voice cracking, my throat tightening as if protesting the unfamiliar sound. He corrected, repeated, and refined until I could feel the subtle resonance, the delicate modulation, and the power hidden in softness. Hours passed, and my voice began to settle into a higher, more melodic register. The process was exhausting, mentally and physically, yet beneath it was a thrill, a realization that even under strict obedience, I could discover a new, private intimacy with my own voice, an awareness that I could control, manipulate, and inhabit. After lunch, I was instructed on gestures, expressions, and attention to minute details of conduct. I practiced the tilt of my head, the lift of my eyebrows, the delicate curve of my lips in subtle smiles. I adjusted the positioning of my hands, the alignment of my fingers, the precise angles of elbows and wrists. Every expression, every movement, every glance became a study in discipline. I lingered in front of the mirror for hours, practicing until I could see the subtle changes, the way my reflection conveyed elegance, restraint, and obedience. I began to notice moments of genuine satisfaction, fleeting but undeniable in the precision of control, the harmony of movement, the beauty of subtlety. Yet at the same time, a gnawing anxiety persisted. Who was I becoming? Was this girl, poised, obedient, graceful, merely a mask, or was she a fragment of myself, previously dormant, now emerging under relentless instruction? The afternoon brought errands into the nearby town, a continuation of previous lessons, but with the added element of social scrutiny. I felt every gaze, every whisper, every glance from strangers as if it were magnified tenfold. My mother held my hand, guiding me subtly, correcting posture, movement, and expression. Each interaction was a test. A smile too small, a word too abrupt, a glance misplaced. Each had consequences, subtle but immediate in the tightening of my chest, the acceleration of my heartbeat. By the time we returned home, I was physically drained, mentally stretched, yet beneath the exhaustion lay a new awareness. I was learning to inhabit this presence in the world, to project calm, elegance, and attention even under the most intense scrutiny. Evenings were the most intense. My parents allowed me moments of solitude, but they were spent in front of the mirror, replaying the day's lessons, adjusting, correcting, and refining. I whispered to the girl reflected back at me. "Who are you? Who am I? Are we the same, or am I losing myself?" Her reflection did not answer in words, but in subtle shifts. The tilt of her head, the lift of her brows, the soft, fleeting smile that seemed almost conspiratorial. I felt a strange intimacy forming with her, a quiet recognition that she was not simply a reflection, but a presence with awareness, identity, and a growing, undeniable claim on my consciousness. By nightfall, exhaustion, tension, and fascination mingled into a strange, almost intoxicating haze. My muscles ached from holding myself with precision, my mind reeled from constant awareness of every nuance of behavior, and yet a deep, unsettling thrill pulsed beneath it all. The recognition that I was becoming her, step by meticulous step, lesson by lesson, correction by correction. I realized then that the process had moved far beyond obedience. It was a reconstruction of identity itself, an intertwining of self, reflection, and instruction. The girl in the mirror was no longer separate from me. She was an active presence, shaping my consciousness, guiding my thoughts, and claiming space within me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I understood something I had resisted acknowledging. This journey was irreversible. Fear, anxiety, fascination, and a strange thrill coexisted in equal measure. The girl in the mirror had become part of me, irrevocably, indelibly, and every lesson, every correction, every fleeting moment of control reinforced her presence. I did not yet know whether I would come to fully embrace her or merely coexist with her, but I knew that she was here, and the path ahead would demand patience, endurance, and a willingness to confront emotions I had never anticipated. By the time sleep began to claim me, I felt a quiet, trembling awareness that my life had been irrevocably transformed. The lessons were no longer just about posture, voice, or movement. They were about the architecture of identity, the delicate weaving of discipline and discovery, and the intimate, terrifying revelation of a self I had not known existed. The girl in the mirror was no longer a reflection, a mask, or an experiment. She was a presence, a companion, a fragment of who I was becoming. And whether I was ready or not, I knew that the journey had only just begun. The day began with a stillness that felt heavier than usual, as if the morning itself was aware of the weight pressing down on me. I awoke with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread, the girl in the mirror already waiting with wide, curious eyes that seemed to pierce into the depths of my soul. She had become more than a reflection. She was a presence, a companion, a subtle echo of possibility that I could neither resist nor fully comprehend. I traced the gentle curve of her cheeks, the soft lines of her lips, the delicate shadow under her eyes, and wondered how much of her was truly me and how much was a careful construction, an intricate tapestry woven by my parents' guidance, discipline, and relentless insistence on obedience. Breakfast was a ritual that seemed to stretch on endlessly, my parents' eyes constantly sweeping over me with measured observation. My father's silence carried a weight far heavier than any command, and my mother's subtle corrections were precise, almost surgical. "Lift your chin slightly, my dear. Sit straighter. Allow your hands to rest lightly on the table." I obeyed, each motion deliberate, controlled, aware of the subtlest nuance of posture, gesture, and expression. Even the rhythm of my chewing became a lesson in precision, a performance that tested endurance and awareness simultaneously. By the time the meal ended, my body ached from tension, my mind was stretched thin with hyper-awareness, and yet beneath it all, I felt a quiet exhilaration. The realization that each act of obedience brought me closer to inhabiting the girl I had become, step by meticulous step. The morning lessons began with posture and walking as always, but today my mother introduced a new level of scrutiny. "Every motion should tell a story," she instructed softly but firmly. "Even when you are alone, even when no one is watching, you are performing, refining, inhabiting presence." I moved through the hallway, practicing a delicate sway of the hips, the subtle lift of my shoulders, the gentle alignment of hands and fingers. Every adjustment was corrected, repeated, analyzed. I could feel the ache in my legs, the tension in my back, the strain of concentration in every muscle. And yet, amidst the fatigue, I noticed a strange clarity. My awareness of my body had deepened to an almost surreal degree. Each movement became a conversation with myself, a negotiation between obedience, expression, and emerging identity. By midday, my father introduced advanced vocal exercises. He had me read passages aloud, observing every inflection, every pause, every shift in tone. At first, my voice stumbled, cracking under the unfamiliar pressure, but gradually the resonance began to settle. Higher, softer, melodic, each word carried subtlety, nuance, and an almost hypnotic control. I practiced in whispered repetitions, alone in the room, discovering the quiet thrill of inhabiting a voice that was simultaneously mine and entirely new. It was intoxicating, the realization that even under strict obedience, I could find intimacy, control, and an almost secret power in the subtle modulation of sound. The afternoon lessons were perhaps the most challenging. My mother instructed me on gestures, expressions, and social poise, taking me through intricate sequences of movement, gaze, and subtle emotional expression. Every smile, tilt of the head, lift of the hand was choreographed, analyzed, and perfected. I lingered in front of the mirror for hours, practicing, adjusting, and refining until I could see the transformation in real time. The girl reflected back at me was patient, poised, aware, and startlingly alive. She had a presence that was no longer merely imposed, no longer merely a reflection, but an emerging consciousness intertwining with mine. I found myself fascinated, frightened, and deeply connected to her at once. Evenings were reserved for reflection, solitary study of self, and the quiet internalization of lessons. I would sit for hours in front of the mirror, tracing the lines of my dress, adjusting the fall of fabric, brushing through my hair, and whispering questions to the girl who had become my constant companion. "Who are you? Who am I? Are we merging or am I losing myself? Her eyes, wide and curious, seemed to respond in subtle ways. The tilt of her head, the gentle curve of her lips, the faint rise of her brows, signals of awareness, presence, and identity. I realized then that the lessons were not merely about obedience or refinement. They were about coexistence, the merging of identities, the delicate navigation of selfhood under constant observation. The psychological weight of the day became more pronounced with each passing moment. I noticed small but significant changes in my thoughts. I anticipated corrections before they were given. I adjusted gestures instinctively, and I found myself analyzing the responses of others with a heightened sensitivity that bordered on obsession. Fear, fascination, curiosity, and reluctant pleasure interwove in my chest, creating a tension that was simultaneously exhausting and thrilling. Every glance, every subtle motion, every word I spoke was now filtered through the lens of the girl I was becoming. And through her, I began to see aspects of myself that had been dormant, hidden beneath layers of familiarity, comfort, and indifference. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of practice, I remained alone in the room, my reflection staring back with unwavering attention. I ran my fingers along the contours of her cheeks, brushed the ends of her hair, and whispered questions I had no answers to. Who am I becoming? Is this really me, or merely the sum of their lessons? The reflection offered no verbal reply, but subtle movements. A shift in gaze, the faint lift of lips, a deliberate posture, communicated a consciousness that was fully present, fully aware, and increasingly inseparable from my own. I realized then that the girl in the mirror was not simply a reflection, but a living, breathing presence within me, shaping thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways that were profound, disorienting, and quietly exhilarating. By the end of the night, the exhaustion, the tension, and the fascination coalesced into a strange, almost intoxicating clarity. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that the lessons were no longer external impositions alone. They had become internalized structures, shaping the very architecture of my identity. The girl in the mirror had become a coexisting self, a parallel consciousness, a presence that demanded attention, acknowledgement, and integration. Fear and excitement pulsed through my chest, intertwined with awe at the subtle complexity of transformation, the delicate interplay of obedience, discovery, and emergent selfhood. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the undeniable truth settle into every fiber of my being. This journey was irreversible. The girl in the mirror was not temporary, not a mask, not a fleeting experiment. She was fully alive within me, and the path ahead would demand endurance, reflection, and courage. I did not yet know whether I would embrace her entirely, resist, or navigate the liminal space between obedience and self-discovery. What I did know was that the lessons, the corrections, the meticulous instruction had forged a presence that was impossible to ignore, and that presence was now an inseparable part of who I was becoming. The morning light poured into my room in a way that felt heavier than usual, as if the day itself was aware of the culmination of all the lessons, corrections, and hours of internalized discipline. I awoke slowly, my body weighted by exhaustion, but electrified with anticipation, the girl in the mirror already waiting with wide, almost questioning eyes. She was no longer simply a reflection. She was a presence, a constant companion, and the deeper I stared into her gaze, the more I recognized the subtle ways in which she had merged with my consciousness. Her expression was calm yet alert, poised yet curious, as though she had been waiting for this day. The day when obedience, instruction, and self-discovery would reach their inevitable apex. I ran my fingers along her cheeks, traced the faint blush my mother had taught me to wear, and felt a shiver of recognition. This was not a mask. This was a self that had been coaxed, shaped, and nurtured into existence, inseparable from the boy I had once been, but infinitely more intricate. Breakfast was quiet, as it always had been, but today it carried a weight I could not ignore. My father's gaze swept over me with its usual intensity, sharp and analytical, noting every nuance of posture, gesture, and expression. My mother's eyes, calm but penetrating, observed every micro-movement, every hesitation, every subtle tension in my hands and shoulders. "Lift your chin and sit fully upright," she instructed softly. I obeyed, every motion deliberate, precise, refined through countless repetitions. My hands rested lightly on the table, my voice measured in response to their questions, each syllable carrying the weight of awareness and discipline I had internalized over weeks of training. Every detail, from the alignment of my shoulders to the gentle tilt of my head, was a silent testament to how far I had come, how meticulously my body and mind had been sculpted into form. The morning's lessons began with walking and posture, as always, but with an intensity I had not yet experienced. My mother guided me through the hallways, observing every subtle movement, every sway of my hips, every tilt of my chin. Every motion should tell a story, she reminded me. I moved deliberately, feeling the precision of my steps, the flow of my arms, the subtle adjustments that had become second nature. My body remembered the countless hours of repetition, and for the first time, I felt a strange harmony between instruction and instinct, a delicate balance where discipline and presence coexisted. The girl I had become was no longer merely practicing. She was inhabiting, fully, consciously, with awareness that felt like a revelation and a responsibility all at once. By midday, my father guided me through advanced vocal exercises. Reading passages aloud, I focused on inflection, rhythm, and resonance, monitoring subtle shifts in tone, pause, and emphasis. My voice, once hesitant and unstable, now carried a melodic, controlled cadence that conveyed poise, attention, and subtle strength. The exercise was exhausting but exhilarating. Each phrase, each word, each breath reinforced the delicate integration of self. The girl in the mirror and the boy I had been were now in constant dialogue, coexisting, merging, and reshaping the contours of thought and identity. I could feel the depth of transformation in my chest, in the subtle rise and fall of my shoulders, in the clarity of my gaze. I was aware of every nuance, every small victory of mastery, and every fleeting flicker of hesitation that reminded me of the journey yet uncompleted. The afternoon introduced social immersion. My mother insisted that I navigate a small gathering of neighbors and acquaintances, practicing composure, attentiveness, and refined social presence. My body tensed as I entered the room, every heartbeat amplified by the awareness that eyes would observe, judge, and respond to this fully formed self. Each gesture was measured, each smile deliberate, each word carefully chosen. The lessons of weeks crystallized into performance, awareness, and instinct simultaneously. I noticed subtle reactions, polite nods, faint smiles, brief glances of curiosity. And yet, amidst the attention, a quiet, unnameable thrill stirred within me. I was fully visible, fully present, inhabiting the girl I had been trained to be, and I could feel the merging of identities, the obedience, the instruction, and the emerging self coalescing into something coherent, tangible, and undeniably mine. Evenings were the crucible of reflection and integration. Alone in my room, I lingered in front of the mirror for hours, tracing every contour of the dress, adjusting the delicate folds, brushing the hair that now felt like an extension of my own identity. The girl in the mirror was no longer separate. She was fully aware, fully alive, fully entwined with my thoughts, emotions, and intentions. I whispered to her, softly, carefully, "Who are you? Who am I? Are we separate or are we one?" Her eyes seemed to answer in subtle movements. The tilt of her head, the curve of her lips, the confident, poised gaze that had been cultivated and nurtured into presence. I felt a shiver of understanding. She was not a reflection, not a mask, not a performance to be discarded. She was a self, living, breathing, and inseparable from my consciousness. The weight of realization was profound. Weeks of lessons, corrections, rehearsals, and reflection had led to this culmination. A merging of identities that was complete yet ongoing, a delicate synthesis of obedience, self-discovery, and presence. Fear, fascination, awe, and subtle exhilaration interwove in my chest, creating a tension that was simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating. Every movement, every gesture, every breath reinforced the integration. I was no longer a student of transformation. I had become the embodiment of its lesson, the living proof of patient guidance, endurance, and discovery. By nightfall, the process had settled into a quiet rhythm of acceptance. I lay on my bed, tracing the lines of the dress, brushing the ends of my hair, and observing the subtle glow in my own eyes as they reflected in the mirror. The girl who had emerged was fully present, fully alive, fully integrated with my consciousness. She had become not only a part of me, but an essential lens through which I now perceived the world, my body, and my identity. And in that moment, I felt a deep, profound clarity. The journey had not merely altered my appearance, voice, or posture. It had reshaped my very sense of self, revealing a depth of identity, awareness, and presence that I had never imagined, and that would continue to grow, evolve, and flourish. The quiet, final lesson was understanding the permanence and inevitability of transformation. This girl, the one I had been trained to become, nurtured to inhabit, and now fully aware of, was not a fleeting experiment. She was a companion, an extension, a fully realized aspect of my being. Fear, uncertainty, and the tension of obedience had given way to acceptance, curiosity, and a subtle, intoxicating sense of liberation. I could feel her presence in every thought, every breath, every heartbeat, and I realized that the journey would continue, not as an imposition but as a choice. A conscious embrace of identity, awareness, and selfhood in its most intricate, delicate, and authentic form. As I finally closed my eyes, the mirror empty of my gaze, I felt a quiet awe settle into my chest. The transformation was complete, yet it was only the beginning. Fear, curiosity, and fascination would remain, intertwined with moments of reflection, challenge, and discovery. But I knew, with unwavering certainty, that I was no longer merely who I had been. I had become her, and in that becoming I had discovered a presence, a consciousness, and a self that was vibrant, intricate, and entirely alive. The journey had been relentless, immersive, and demanding, but the reward was undeniable. I had found her, I had found myself, and in that discovery lay a quiet, breathtaking freedom I had never known before.